Thank you very much, On. And special thanks to Ronen Yitzhak for arranging this very interesting conference and bringing so many people who work on Jordan together. And this hasn't happened so often before. So very well done and congratulations. Essentially, I will try to put together much of what it is that we have spoken about today into a coherent picture of a century of Jordanian history. The slogan for the Jordanian celebrations, وَتَسْتَمِرَ الْمَسِيرَ, the march or the procession continues, is not very exciting, not very imaginative either. But it captures what I call the muddling through. Jordan has muddled through for a century, but that is an achievement all the same. Jordan has a continuity and a stability that many of its neighbors cannot compete with. In the 1950s, Jordanians would compare Jordan negatively with the neighbors. The neighbors were Abdel Nasser, the liberator, the progressive regimes as they were called, and Jordan was part of the reactionaries. Abdel Nasser for the Palestinians was the liberator, and Hussein for the Palestinians was the collaborator. Today, Jordanians compare themselves with their neighbors very favorably. They are an island of stability, with neighbors like Syria and Iraq. And a key factor in today's Jordanian stability is the fear of Jordanians to rock the boat, to create a Syrian-like catastrophe. So Jordan, as we have heard, is an artificial creation. True. Very true. Habib Bourguiba said of Jordan, it's
artificial.
Qadia Mustana. Palestine is the real issue. And it is true. But Jordan has done a lot better than its ostensibly more state-like neighbors, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, with their historical capital cities. Relative fertility and wealth seemed so much more promising. But that was an illusion. Jordan had no urban center. Yoav Alon spoke today about Salt having 12,000 people when Abdallah arrived. There was no urban center, sparsely populated, this dusty desert principality with no resources. Abdallah himself had no patience for Jordan. He dreamt of Damascus. He envied his brother Faisal, ensconced by the British in Iraq. But the horrid fate of the Hashemites in Baghdad and what has become in recent years of Damascus and Iraq compare very poorly with Jordan's march that still continues. Maybe just muddling through with a poor hand, but much better than the neighbors whose citizens, millions of them, seek refuge in Jordan. Syrians, Iraqis, and of course, Palestinians. So how come? When I compare with the neighbors, the most important factor that comes to mind immediately is that Jordan, as opposed to its neighbors in the Fertile Crescent, is not a sectarian mosaic. Jordan, in terms of its sectarian composition, is uniform, homogeneous, Sunni, Muslim, Arab. And in the post-Arab nationalist era, Islamic politics have exacerbated sectarianism even further, causing the statist implosion in countries like Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. One can say, when I speak about sectarian homogeneity, you could say, well, what about the Palestinians and the Jordanians? What about the obvious divergence between them? And there is an obvious divergence between them. But I would say that Jordanians and Palestinians have as much in common as Sunni Muslims or Orthodox Christians than what divides them. Michel Adouani, in a brilliant article in the Journal of Palestine Studies many years ago, spoke about the post-Arab nationalist era as a time when political language was being increasingly recodified along sectarian lines. And when political language is recodified along sectarian lines, sectarian common ground, which does exist between Jordanians and Palestinians, has great value. Jordanianism and Palestinianism are not social fault lines in Jordan when it comes to issues like marriage, for example. Jordanians and Palestinians marry each other all the time. Muslims with Muslims, Christians with Christians. The sectarian fault line exists, but not the Jordanian-Palestinian one. Jordanianism and Palestinianism are very real, but recent, historically shallow in comparison to the 7th century division between Sunnis and Shiites. Three stabilizing factors have influenced Jordanian continuity. First, the emergence of a Trans-Jordanian political elite relatively early on. This begins in the 1920s and 1930s and comes to fruition under Hussein in the 1950s, when he begins to appoint regularly Jordanian prime ministers. Regularly. Hani al-Mulki, Hassan Najari, Wasfi Dal. Not Samira Rifai and company. The emergence of a Trans-Jordanian political elite. Jordan is their patrimony. They have no other. And Jordan is their locus of self-determination. Secondly, the security establishment in all its parts. And I say in all its parts, the army, the police, but most of all, the mukhabarat. Thirdly, Jordan's geopolitical centrality. The geopolitical centrality between Syria and Saudi Arabia, between Iraq and Israel-Palestine, situated at the heart of the Palestinian problem. No matter what the solution of the Palestinian problem will ever be, it will have to affect Jordan deeply. Jordan is geopolitically too important to fail. And there are therefore many out there in the international community and in the region itself, notably Israel too, that will be there to keep Jordan from failing when need be. An American diplomat in the 1950s said there is no reason for Jordan to exist, other than it would be a lot worse for us if it didn't. So in this rather poor reality with which Abdullah began, Abdullah chose Amman as his capital. Not the small towns of the East Bank that did exist, like Salt and Irbil, but Amman, this little town of some 3,000 people, many of whom were Circassians. By 1948, Amman surpassed both Salt and Irbil, had 100,000 people. And it was then inundated by Palestinians in their hundreds of thousands who dominated the country's administrative and commercial hub. The choice of Amman as a capital led to the unforeseen consequences of the Palestinian domination of the Jordanian economy and the private sector of later years that was to become a serious problem, and fear of the East Bankers, fear of challenge to their political supremacy that was built into the kingdom in its early years. East Bankers today speak of themselves as an endangered species, as Red Indians. The fear not only of the Palestinians, but of all the other foreigners who have migrated to the country, Syrians, Iraqis, in addition to the millions of Palestinians and other foreigners of many kinds. The electoral system has been gerrymandered to favor the East Banker periphery against Amman and Zarqa, which is the main Palestinian metropolitan center, which is the main center of the Jordanian state and economy and administration. But parliament has a marginal status, as we know, in Jordanian politics. Jordanians today ridicule the Jordanian parliament. They call it the Hello Chamber. The Hello Chamber because of the telephone calls that the members of parliament get from the Mukhabarat or from the palace, telling them what it is that they should do. So the gerrymandering of the political system, of the parliament, that is, doesn't necessarily satisfy. לא
בלי מיקרופון.
לא, חשוב זה להקלטה. לא תהיה הקלטה.
לא תהיה הקלטה?
לא,
חשוב במגעים. אבל זה באמת מקליט מפה, לא?
לא.
זה מקליט משניהם, זה לא...
אנחנו ננסות, תסדר.
חשוב במגעים של המיקרופון.
אולי נדבר
בלי מיקרופון כאן.
איך נעלה את זה לאי?
אפשר בלי זה.
שמעו.
כן? זה לא הקלטה שם של זה.
There have been three phases to the evolution of Jordanianness that we have spoken about today quite a lot. And I would add, when talking about Jordanianness, as I would say about any other collective identity, collective identities are rarely uniform, and there is core and periphery in collective identity too. Jordanians are Muslims, Arabs, and Jordanians, just like Egyptians are Muslims, Arabs, and Egyptians. And these identities tend to have a relatively higher or lower level at different periods of time. Core and periphery in collective identity change. In phase one, in Jordan, we're talking about Abdullah I. Abdullah matured in the latter years of the Ottoman Empire. Abdullah matured and gained his education in the era of Islamic reform and the Islamized version of Arab nationalism. Under Abdullah I, there was no serious effort to develop a narrow territorial Jordanianism, but an Islamic Arab motif. A Hashemite-led Arabism of which Jordan was to be a leading part for the creation of what Abdullah dreamt would be Greater Syria. He did not like the name Sharq al-Urdun. Sharq al-Urdun, Trans-Jordan. He wanted to call Sharq al-Urdun a Sharq al-Arabi. A Sharq al-Arabi, that is the Arab East, beginning in Jordan but ending in Damascus eventually. The British, for that reason, would not allow him to call it a Sharq al-Arabi. But the official newspaper, which if you go to the National Library in Jordan and downtown Amman, in the top floor, there are hundreds of copies of the old Sharq al-Arabi newspaper piled up in one of the rooms there. He got it on the newspaper, and he got it in the army, a Jaish al-Arab. That the British had out. But not to call Sharq al-Urdun a Sharq al-Arab. But that's just an indication of Abdullah's own attitude towards this dusty principality that he inherited. His aspirations in Syria were unrealistic and had no basis. There was only one country in which he had a basis for expansion, and that was Palestine. In Palestine, as opposed to Syria, he had allies, 3 of them. The Zionists, the British, and the Mu'arab, the Mufti's opponents. Phase 2 is the unity of the 2 banks under the Hashemite Arabism of King Hussein. Not expansions. Hussein had no expansionist ideas. Hussein was all about the preservation of the Hashemite kingdom in its post-1948 formation against the radical Arab nationalist movement headed by the likes of Abdel Nasser. Jordan presented versus Abdel Nasser in this period between 1948 and 1967 an Arab unionist Islamist counterweight to Abdel Nasser, whereas the Jordanians would say sought to Bolshevize the Arabs, Bolshevik. Not a Jordanian territorialism, but al-Watan al-Arabi al-Saghir as part of al-Watan al-Arabi al-Kabir. That was the language of the textbooks in the 1950s and the 1960s. Phase 3 is after 1967. The crushing defeat of Abdel Nasser, the crushing defeat of Nasserism, the pursuit, the unbridled pursuit of raison d'etat, of the Arab statist interest. Unapologetic in pursuing state interests rather than the Arab national cause. The United Arab Republic becomes Egypt, and the rise of Palestinianism after 1967 is accelerated. Jordanianness emerges as the ultimate versus the ultimate Palestinian other. Black September is the radical turning point. But it is not just versus the Palestinians. It is the deliberate effort by the regime from top down and by much of the tribal public from the bottom up to do what Emmanuel Sivan wrote, in use of a usable past, to mobilize the various chapters of East Bank history, Roman, Nabatean, Islamic, all as components of an authentic Jordanian identity, adopting and assimilating the Roman, Nabatean, and Islamic past as part of the Jordanian national heritage. After Black September, we have the beginning of what the Jordanians then called Ardana. Ardana, not our country Ardana, but Ardana from Urdu, Jordanization. The removal of the Palestinians from the bureaucracy and from the army, and the creation of what one could call a functional cleavage. The cleavage between the East Bankers on the government payroll, in the bureaucracy, in the defense establishment, and receiving social welfare, and the Palestinians, on the other hand, increasingly dominant in the private sector and the professional class. This new social contract, as it emerged after 1970, financed by the Arab oil wealth of the 1970s and the early 80s. Support from the Arab states and from Jordanians, many of whom were Palestinians, bringing the remittances that Orn spoke about, working in the Gulf. But then came the crash of 1989. The crash of 1989, the oil countries couldn't produce the wealth they once did. The remittances declined, and the Jordanian economy crashed. This required a new economic policy that had dramatic socio-political consequences. reducing government spending on demand of the IMF, the World Bank, in exchange for bailout funding, meant cutbacks in government jobs, meant cutbacks in welfare and subsidies, meant more privatization, all of which hurt the East Bankers. Hurt the East Bankers more than the Palestinians in the private sector. And here the riots of 1989 were not amongst the Palestinians. The riots of 89, as we know, were in the south. The ultra-loyalist, royalist south of old. The old social contract was no longer workable. In Israel to this day, Israelis think that the Hashemite regime rules in Jordan against a vicious Palestinian opposition. All of this is completely wrong. This has lost its relevance some 30, 40 years ago. In the early years after the annexation of the West Bank, the regime wanted nothing more than to preserve the status quo. It is common for us to say, and it is constantly said, that in the war of 1948, Israel won and the Arabs lost. That's only half true. Jordan did not lose in 1948. Jordan won in 1948. And Jordan, after 1948, wanted to preserve the gains of its victory, the West Bank and Jerusalem. That is more or less what they wanted, and they got it, as opposed to the other Arab states who did not. So Jordan was a status quo country after 1948, absorbing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, 900,000 Palestinians, half of whom were refugees, absorbed into the kingdom, now 2/3 of the population. The Palestinians wanted anything but the status quo. The Palestinians wanted to turn the historical clock back to 1948. Exactly what the Jordanian regime did not wish to do. So the regime and the Palestinians were obviously rivals and enemies. But the tables have turned. The Palestinians today in Jordan want integration more than anything else. They want integration more than the original Jordanians are willing to accept that. They are more of an asset than a liability, certainly to the economy. The East Bankers, somewhat less so. But Hussein didn't do a great deal to change this. The crisis is 1989. Hussein died 10 years later. But he didn't introduce in those 10 years revolutionary changes. Hussein, as one scholar, many here, I'm sure everybody here knows it, Malik Mufti. Malik Mufti said of Hussein that he was notoriously uninterested in economic matters. He had little real understanding of economic affairs, in the words of one British ambassador. He even seemed unable or unwilling to do his financial homework, turning his Nelsonic eye on the country's finances. That is Roderick Parkes, the British ambassador in the mid-60s, writing about Hussein. Hussein very reluctantly engaged in the IMF reform program after the crash of 1989. But by the time of his death in 1999, he had not gone very far. There was minimal disturbance of the social order. Hussein first believed in the peace dividend, as we saw. That took him to the mid-90s. He was waiting for the peace dividend to save the Jordanian economy. And then he became awfully ill, and this was not on his priority. The critical turning point in Jordan's more recent history is not the Arab Spring. The critical turning point is the death of Hussein. Hussein and Abdullah, very different personalities, very different policies. First, background, education and culture. Language. Abdullah speaks English much better than he speaks Arabic. The problem is that everybody in Jordan knows that. He was brought up outside the country. He grew up in England and then in the United States. From the age of 5 or 6 until he was in his 20s, he didn't live in Jordan. He has little, if any, real familiarity with the tribes, as very much as opposed to Hussein, who was intimately familiar with the tribes and their ways, and spoke an Arabic that Jordanians admired. Hussein was a great communicator, which Abdallah is not. Abdallah is seen by the East Bankers as an outsider, and he has spoken disrespectfully of tribal elders as dinosaurs. There is some tension and impatience in the relationship between him and them, and between the tribal people and Abdallah. That his wife is Palestinian doesn't make things any better. Hussein had what I called a monarchical presence. Abdallah doesn't have that. 23 years in power. People still compare him to Hussein. He looks in the mirror we saw today, in that picture, and sees Hussein. He himself dreams of himself to be Hussein. Just imagine, do you think of King Hussein when he was 23 years on the throne, that is in 1975, 1976, after the Yom Kippur War, that anybody is comparing him with Abdallah I? It's unthinkable. I have done some research over the last few years writing a book. One of the things I did was to read everything, every speech Abdallah gave. And it's very easy to do that these days. You just go to the website and all the speeches are there. You can read all of them. Every speech, every interview. Abdallah gives the same number of speeches a year, more or less, that Hussein would give. Yeah, 25, 30 speeches a year. Maybe 3 of the 30 are in Arabic in Jordan. The other 27 are in English abroad. Abdallah speaks much more to foreign audiences in English than he speaks in Arabic to his own people. Just go to the website and count the speeches. It's all there. With Hussein was totally different. Every crisis would mean a speech to the nation. Abdallah opens Parliament with a kind of a 10-minute presentation, which he writes on a page or 2. Hussein used to speak for an hour. A kind of State of the Nation address. Abdallah is uncomfortable, it seems, speaking to his own people in their own language on a regular basis. But this is not a one-man show. Never was a one-man show. And we have in Jordan what one scholar has called not a monopoly, but a duopoly. The palace and the mukhabarat. It was with King Hussein, the palace and the mukhabarat too. The palace and the Trans-Jordanian elite too. And I could give much evidence to this reality from the book I wrote about Wasfita, but never to the degree that it is now. Where in Jordan, people are not quite sure who it is actually running the show. Initiatives taken by Abdallah, as we will see, are shut down by the East Banker elite, of which the mukhabarat are a very important part. Abdallah, as opposed to Hussein, sees the kingdom very much through its economy. Exactly what Hussein did not do. Not necessarily was Hussein more correct, but that was the way he ran things. For Abdallah, the economy is top priority. Jordan's long-term stability and Hashemite survival depend on Jordan's economic performance. That is Abdallah's vision. He has a very determined neoliberal approach, shifting the economic emphasis from the public sector to the private, which maybe in economic terms is the right thing to do. but is certainly very damaging from the point of view of the regime's relationship with the other side of the social contract, the East Bankers. Abdallah composed a national agenda, he and his advisors. A national agenda 2005-2006, which was about enhancing the private sector, integrating Palestinians in government based on merit rather than connections, wasta, making the electoral system more representative. But the agenda was shut down by the East Banker elite, forcing Abdallah to fire the prime movers of the reform project. They told him who to kick out, and he kicked them out. One of them was Bassem al-Adawi, who now returned as a coup conspirator. I doubt very much that there is any real foundation to that. And Abdallah has been, as a result, on collision course with the East Bankers. The neoliberal economic reforms were undermining their economic well-being and their political influence. Protest coming from the very heart of the establishment, the retired army officers, the tribal leaders, and the tribal younger generation that has appeared in the Arab Spring and since, the Iraq, the movement that we have heard already mentioned. The condemnation of Abdallah by them and his family is sometimes extreme and blatant. I do not recall anything similar to that in Hussein's time, except when Hussein was in the very early years on the throne, when he was 18 or 19 or 20, in the heady days of Abdel Nasser. But the Iraq has its limitations. There is no common leadership, there is no common program, there is no common organization. Here I would add a word about the pros and cons of social media, which I think, quite honestly, are greatly exaggerated. Even to the extent of the way the Israeli army speaks about what it is supposed to achieve. תמונת ניצחון, שינצחו, צריך את התמונה. תמונת ניצחון איננה תחליף לניצחון. The social media provide a virtual power which is very often confused with real power. You can bring so many people to a demonstration, many will stay at home. How many people actually turn up to the demonstration? You should count the numbers in Amman, not that many. Social media, I would argue, and this I think was very true in the Arab Spring, in Egypt in particular, where the social media, as it was called, the Facebook, Twitter revolution, well, it ended up with Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in power. Not the people with Facebook and Twitter, but the men with the guns. So the pros and cons of social media work partly for the demonstrators and for the opponents. They also work for the regime. The East Bankers don't really have attractive options. What do they want? There is this fear of chaos. Horrifying examples from next door. Democratization? Sure, they speak of it much. But what about the Palestinian majority? What do they really want to achieve with democratization? There is a lot of uncertainty amongst East Bankers about creating a more representative parliament, precisely for that reason. There are serious tensions between Jordanians and Palestinians in various places of social interaction, the campuses of the universities, for example, the soccer league, the football games between Faisali, the Jordanian team, and Baghdad, the Palestinian team. And then, of course, the ongoing socio-economic crisis. Although Jordan manages, as we heard from on. But the crisis is a crisis and there is no end in sight. And rapid population growth makes it ever more difficult to make ends meet. The Jordanians speak endlessly about corruption. There is endemic corruption. Abishai mentioned this morning with Hussein's time. Going back to the British diplomatic reports of Hussein's time, they too speak of the corruption not only in Jordan but in the royal family. And it is probably deeply there today as well. And therefore increasing the tax burden, when the popular image is that the leadership is lining its pockets with public funds, doesn't go down very well and creates enormous protest. But the corruption is not the reason for the Jordanian poorly performing economy. Jordan has a built-in economic distress resulting from the imbalance between resources and population. Corruption doesn't add anything, but it's not as critical as the public seems to think. But poverty is rampant. Unemployment is very high. You hear figures that are unbelievable amongst the youth. I think I want to say 40%. I've seen even higher figures. People just guess, I think. I don't think anybody really knows. But the figures are enormous. There's no question about that. And if all these problems were not enough, foreign aid is harder to come by as the US pivots to Asia and Middle Eastern oil wealth, just up to the crisis in the Ukraine, is no longer what it once was. The Arab oil countries are less generous to Jordan than they once were, and it's even more difficult for the Jordanians to get the amount of money that they really need from the United States. So there is this prevalent sense of disorientation and uncertainty. And it is this disorientation and uncertainty that flowed straight into the Hamza affair. The Hamza affair was born out of this disorientation and sense of uncertainty. Just as Jordan prepared for the centenary celebration in April 2021, just as Jordan celebrated its longevity and the victory over the historical skeptics, the unprecedented crisis within the royal family between Abdullah and Hamza broke. And here there is the story like between Abdullah and Hussein, the personalities of Abdullah versus Hamza. In the eyes of many Jordanians, and this I think was what Avi said this morning as well, Abdullah was totally surprised by the fact that Hussein wanted him as king. He was not Hussein's natural choice. Hamza was. And I think many Jordanians really believe that if Hussein had lived longer, he probably would have appointed Hamza, which would have required a change in the constitution and a few other things. But he never got there. And the disease, the lymphatic cancer from which he suffered, got back to him much earlier than he had expected. And Hussein died. He was very young. I remember I used to teach many years ago, and I used to say that Abdullah didn't make peace with the Israelis, partly because he was getting old and he didn't have full control of the country. Well, I am now much older than he was then. I never thought when I used to give those lectures that I would want to be in that position. But it happens, so it does. Hussein died when he was 63. Hamza was only 18 or 19 at the time. And becoming king at that time, Hussein knew the experience better than anybody and did not want to repeat the act. The reason why he preferred Abdullah was because he never had time to change the constitution. He was dying. The constitution allows the monarchy to pass from the king to his eldest son or to one of his brothers. Hamza was neither. He couldn't change the constitution, and Hamza was too young. And so Abdullah was preferred, and many in Jordan to this day believe that Hamza really was the king who should have been. He was Hussein's favorite. Hamza is very popular. He looks like Hussein. He sounds like Hussein. He speaks like Hussein. For the tribes critical of Abdallah, Hamza is everything that Abdallah is not. He is no outsider. He is one of them. Familiar with their language, familiar with their ways, with which he was brought up since his youth. In the early days of the Arab Spring, the Iraq came out openly in favor of Hamza. But Abdallah's accusation of subversion and a coup is not very convincing. I don't believe there was a coup, and I don't believe that Hamza was engaged in subversion. And to the best of my knowledge, most Jordanians don't believe it either. There is no hard evidence for foreign intervention either. Hamza met a lot with the tribes. They would invite him to hear their complaints, and he would listen. And he would listen with a sense of participation, with a sense of solidarity. They no doubt appreciated his solidarity, but that is not subversion. Abdallah must have felt threatened. The accusations of subversion were an attempt to undermine Hamza's popularity, but they did not have the desired effect. Both men avoided a head-on collision and achieved ostensible reconciliation under the auspices of Hassan, who is now the eldest statesman of the family, 74 years old, going on, oh, he's already 75.
75.
Already 75. Birthday's on the 20th of March. It has been. So Abdallah talks of the fitna that was avoided. I want to say a word about fitna. Abdallah uses the word fitna as a deterrence to the population. Fitna has an Islamic negative connotation. And Abdallah spoke in reference to Hamza about atraf al-fitna min dakhil bayt. That was the sentence he used. But he also talks about fitna when he talks about Syria or Iran. Beware of those who wish to create fitna in our society. So it is a warning against the collapse of Syria. It is a warning against the so-called subversion of Hamza. But I say the so-called subversion. It would appear that the crisis was put behind them, but it is not so. The crisis in the family is obviously not over. Hamza's recent announcement that he is relinquishing his title suggests exactly that. The crisis is not over. So in conclusion, where do we stand with the three historical stabilizing factors? We started with the elite. The elite is less cohesive than it was in the past, even within the family. And the kind of crisis that exists presently between Abdallah and Hamza is without precedent. There have been crises within the family, but not of this nature. So the elite, even within the family, is somewhat less cohesive. The basic loyalty of the security establishment is unshaken. It was immediately noticed that in the troubles with Hamza, no one, but not anyone, in the military or the police was accused of being part of it. So the basic loyalty of the security establishment remains unshaken. The third point, geopolitical centrality, is not as important as it once was. At the height of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Cold War, and the importance of oil, Jordan was a critical facet of regional stability. It is somewhat less so, and it is harder for Jordan to obtain critical aid today than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Jordan is in need of desperate top-down reform. It needs generous foreign aid to revitalize the economy, especially employment for the younger generation. improve infrastructure, electricity and water, and the quality of life. All of this is easier said than done. Much easier said than done. The lack of a clear, desirable alternative to Abdullah is probably the most important asset he has to maintain royal Hashemite stability in the Kingdom of Jordan. Thank you.